Thank you so much, everyone, for welcoming me so warmly today. So you asked about the house by the lake. The place to start really, I think, is when I first encountered the house. It was in 1993 when my grandmother, her name was Elsie, we called her Granny. So this is the mother of Frank, my father, who's here today, and Vivian, who's here today. She decided, she was 80 years old, and she decided to take her grandchildren back to Germany for the first time. She wanted to introduce us to the city of her birth. And she showed us the apartment that they used to live in on the Kaiserallee. It's now called the Bundesallee, in the middle of Berlin, and the school that they used to go to. But not very much was left in terms of traces of the family. And then she took us out of Berlin. If you've been to Berlin, to the west of Berlin, there's a series of lakes just around Potsdam, just north of Potsdam. And in 1920s, her father, Alfred Alexander, he was a very well-known doctor. He was the head of the Berlin Doctors Association. His clients included Marlene Dietrich, Albert Einstein, Max Reinhardt. So he had this incredible mixture of clients, but actually he just wanted a quiet life. And so he built this very small wooden house, like a dacha, just outside of Berlin, overlooking this small lake called Großglienicke Lake. And my grandmother, Granny, she wanted to show us the house. And so we went to see the house. We drove out there, and I was there with my cousins and my fiance, Deborah. And we got out the big red van, and my grandmother, she was a larger-than-life character. She had white hair and bright red lipstick, and she had a cigarette in her hand and a black mink coat, and she was striding down this sandy path towards this little wooden house. And a dog was barking, and a man came out the house, a tall, thin man, and he said, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" And my grandmother said, well, I'm the Alexanders. We're the Alexanders. We've come to see the house. And he said, "The Alexanders? The Alexanders? Please come inside." This was 1993, just 3 years after the Berlin Wall had come down. And we went inside this little house, and my grandmother was showing us around the house, and he was showing us around the house, and they were both full of pride. And he pointed outside the back window towards the lake, and he said, in between the back of the house and the lake, that's where the Berlin Wall was built. So through the garden, between the house and the lake. So the people, when he was younger, they couldn't access the lake. And they showed each other around the house, and we had photographs and lots of laughs. And afterwards, I asked my grandmother, Granny, about it. And she said this was her soul place. This is her special place. This is a place that had really good memories of her time when she was a child back in Germany, when she was younger. And she was happy that somebody was looking after the house. She was happy. That was 1993. And then 20 years later, I went back to the house. Somebody suggested I go and see the house. 20 years later, in 2013. And the house was now very different. It was overgrown. The windows were broken. There was graffiti on the walls. There was junk and broken furniture. And in one back bedroom where my grandmother's parents had been, their bedroom, Alfred Alexander and his wife Henny had been, that was now a drug den. There was mattresses and bent spoons, and it was so depressing, so distressing. And I had this feeling in my stomach, you know, that feeling when a child falls off a swing, that horrible feeling. And I felt this real sadness. And I was very surprised by my connection to this house, because I'd never lived there. I'd only seen it once before with my grandmother. And so I really wanted to do something. I wanted to explore the history of the house. And that's what set me on the road to researching the story of the house.
Tell us about your family's lives in Berlin. What was their, how did they live? What did they think of Germany at the time? Their lives were good. So maybe you can describe that.
Yeah, so I was telling you about Alfred Alexander. He was a doctor. They had a lovely apartment in Berlin. There was 22 rooms. There was a maid, and there was a cook. There was a chauffeur. There was even a man who came every week to wind up the clocks. You know, they had a very nice life. They had 2 cars. One was for the chauffeur, and one was for Alfred, because Alfred liked to drive himself. And they had a fabulous time. Their milieu was, imagine 1920s Berlin, the dancers and the artists and the scientists. They had wonderful parties at New Year's Eve where they dressed up, and they considered themselves Germans. My great-grandfather, Alfred, he had fought in the First World War. He'd been a doctor, and he'd been given the Iron Cross First Class. And so when in the 1930s, things began to change with the rise of the National Socialists, Alfred Alexander was very, very confident that things would get better. And even when his friends told him, look, it's time to go, it's time to go, he thought, no, they should stay. You know, this was the country with great artists and scientists and philosophers. You know, they would understand what was right. And then his two twin sons were thrown out of school, and his daughter, my grandmother, was thrown out of university. She was studying to be a journalist at Heidelberg. His other daughter, Bella, had already left to go to England with her English husband. And things became increasingly difficult. He could no longer work as a doctor. The Gestapo were clearly interested in him. And in 1935, he went to visit his daughter in England because she just had a baby, Peter. And he received word back from Berlin that he should stay in England because the Gestapo were out to arrest him. And that was really the beginning of the transition where my family, you know, one by one, they made their way from Berlin. It wasn't easy to get out. And then, of course, they had to pay the escape tax, which was the Nazis had this very high fee they had to pay. And to pay that, you had to basically liquidate all your assets. So over the summer of 1936, during the Summer Olympics in Berlin, my grandmother and her mother tried to sell my great-grandfather's clinic in Berlin. Very difficult. It was it was owned by a Jewish family, lots of Jewish doctors. Eventually, they found someone who'd buy it, but at a huge discount. And by the autumn of 1936, both my grandmother and her mother were able to get out to England. And that's where they tried to build a new life.
And can you tell us a little bit about the Alexander Torres scroll too, and how that was taken out? That's a great story here, if you can.
Absolutely. So Alfred Alexander, he came from a family from the south of Germany, and it was seen as a blessing, to have a Torah in the family. In fact, one of the commandments, I think there's 613 commandments. One of the commandments is that you should commission somebody to create a Torah for you.
Last commandment.
The last commandment, exactly. And so that the family did that about 300 years before, and it'd been passed down the male line from father to son, and then he'd inherited it. He brought it to Berlin when he moved to Berlin, and he offered it to a series of synagogues. This is a very large Torah and very heavy, as Stuart will remember. It's a very, very tall Torah, and he offered it to a variety of synagogues on loan, because he said, look, this is a family Torah, but you're welcome to have it, temporarily. And nobody wanted it on loan. They had their own Torahs, they said, or they wanted to have one they could keep. So Alfred kept it in his apartment on the Kaiser Allee, which was fortunate because when they had to flee to London, they were able to transport it over to England. They sent word back to Berlin to the maid to pack everything up, and she did. She packed everything up, and when I say everything, I mean everything. So even the garbage cans, the trash cans were sent. My great-grandfather's First World War uniform was sent, which of course wouldn't be too popular in London. And when it arrived, my great-uncles went up and down the road, putting different parts, including the pike helmet, in trash cans up and down the road. But underneath some clothes, wrapped up in a blanket, was the Alexander Torah. And that became very important because the German Jewish and Austrian Jewish refugees, when they came to London, they wanted to form their own community, and they didn't have a Torah. Luckily, the Alexanders had one, which they then donated. Again, they lent to this new synagogue, which has become one of the important synagogues in London, called the Belsai Square Synagogue. And for many years, it was the main Torah used by the community. And by the 70s and 80s, it became very worn out. There was holes. Some of the ink had bled. One of the rods in the Torah had broken. So my great-uncle Hans, being my great-uncle Hans, he'd taken a broom handle and used that as the rod. So it wasn't really kosher anymore. And so it was kind of put aside. And then about 10, 15 years ago, the family got together and we decided, we really thought we should have it used again and be such a precious item. And so it was handed over to a specialist, a sofa, who then repaired the characters and put a new proper handle on and so on. And so when my daughter, Sam, was bat mitzvahed, she and her cousin, Sipan, read from the Torah. So it's now very much part of the community again and very, very valued by the community.
One of the highlights of my tenure there in fixing, we had a sofer come, fixed up the Torah scroll so we could read it. And I had the real honor of, it wasn't easy to read from. The print is very condensed and huge. So I had to look over the lectern in order to be able to read. And of course, we had the pleasure of the B'nai mitzvah that were highlight in reading from the Torah scroll. So tell me about your family's feelings about Germany, what happened, and how your book changed the dynamics in your own family.
Right.
In the way that they,
Yeah, so the journey has not been simple or easy. So after I saw the house, I went to see the city of Potsdam, who owned the house. And I can explain that later, but the city of Potsdam owned the house, and I found out that they were planning to knock it down. And I said, is there any way to save it? Because I had this strong feelings. And they said, there's only one way, and you have to prove that it has important history and culture. You have to prove that it's of importance. And they said, it's not going to be very easy. There's lots of very important properties in Potsdam. There's lots of very important properties in Berlin. It's a very small house. It's not a palazzo. It's not a villa. My uncle Michael calls it a bicycle shed. You have to imagine it's 9 meters by 10 meters. And so I decided I'd research the story. And so I started talking to people in the village and gathering the stories. And then I went back home to talk to my members of my family, and I presented to them what I'd found and, why the house was, needing to be saved and the importance of the history. And at the time, I was hoping for well done and attaboy and let's help you. And I think I misjudged the situation, and I encountered quite a lot of anger, and I felt really I'd misjudged the whole thing. One person said, how are you meant to do this? You can't speak German, you live in England. Somebody else said, what are your plans? Do you have a business plan? What's your ideas? Do you have any money? And my dad, who's here today, said, do you really expect us to put our hands in our pocket? And he didn't even have to end the sentence, because the property had been stolen from us. The Gestapo had seized the property. And I felt really, I made a big mistake. And I started gathering my papers. And then one of my cousins said, actually, I'll go out. I'll be really interested to help out. And then somebody else said, look, there's an opportunity here, a very precious opportunity at reconciliation. If the local residents are really interested in this house, in the Jews of the village, in what happened here, in the history, in acknowledging the atrocity, then it would be a mistake not to engage in this process of reconciliation. So what we agreed was those people who wanted to go, they could go, and those who didn't, they didn't have to go. And then a few months later, I think it was April 2014, 14 members of the family, including my Aunt Vivian, my parents here today, went over to the house. And the first thing we had to do was clean it up. I mean, it was such a mess. Like, I'm not exaggerating. The place was a disaster. You couldn't see it. It was so many bushes and trees around. So the first thing is we cut back the bushes and the trees, and we pulled out the old mattresses and the broken appliances. And we spent the day doing that. And then that evening, we had a community event in the village, which the mayor of the village, had organized. And he was giving the history of the village, and he was explaining that before the war, a quarter of the residents of the village were Jewish. And they had started a project to try and find out what happened, which is one of the reasons I'd been in touch with them. And he then, very interesting, played some radio broadcasts of Heinrich Himmler and Hitler talking about the need for the extermination of Jewish people. And at the time, it was very, it had a profound effect. I mean, for obvious reasons, but also you have to understand that this house was in East Germany. So, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar that Berlin was split between the West and the East, but also Berlin, if you imagine, was an island inside East Germany. And the house was just to the west of West Berlin, so it was in East Germany. And what the mayor said was that before the wall came down during the East German times, the children were taught that the National Socialists were the problem of the West German. The East Germans had nothing to do with it because, of course, how could they? They were the communists. They couldn't. Why would they? They couldn't be involved with the Nazis. And he said that, of course, that's not true. And so playing those radio broadcasts had a profound effect. And then I stood up and I gave my talk about the history of the house and what a wonderful day it had been. And I put a picture up on the screen of my grandmother, Elsie. She had white trousers and white shirt and white shoes. She was playing tennis. There was a tennis court at the bottom of the garden, just by the lake. There was a tennis court. My grandmother wasn't very good at tennis, nor was her sister, which was unfortunate because there was no fence, so they would always knock the balls into the lake. But I said, this is my grandmother Elsie, and I was speaking English as always. I couldn't speak German, and then somebody said, called from the. So my father then said, "That's my mother." Just explaining, that's my mother, but he said it in German, and somebody said, "You speak German?" And he stood up and he said, "Well, not very well." And then for the next 6 or 7 minutes, he spoke in perfect German about how wonderful it had been there today, how pleasing it had been, how moving he had found it, meeting people from the village, seeing the house being cleared up, seeing this commitment to the history. And something changed in that moment. But before then, it had been us, the returning German Jews, and them, the local residents. And there was something about my father standing up, speaking German, recognizing the story that really changed the dynamic. And since then, that was 2014. It's been 7 years, and it's been the most extraordinary period. I have to say that when I first was going back to German, I was fearful. I had this sense of foreboding. I was very anxious, especially when I was looking at elderly people. What did you do during the war? And over the last 7 years, that has gone away. As I've spent more and more time with Germans from this village, as we've saved the house. It's now a monument. It's now a federal monument. It's protected. It can never be destroyed. We then raised over $1 million to repair the house and return it back to its former days with beautiful colors of blues, mustard yellows and turquoise blues and ox reds. It's just absolutely beautiful house. Very stunning. And then since then, we've now opened it up to the public, and we do workshops with people doing reconciliation workshops. We work with schools doing education workshops. So it's been this extraordinary journey. And during that time, I think it'd be fair to say that members of the family have become more and more supportive, and now are wholly supportive and excited about this project. And it has been a deeply moving experience, I think, for me, but also other members of the family.
Part of the dedication, if you remember, was it 3 years ago?
That's right.
We had Shabbat dinner there. We had all the locals come, and the media was there. It was I can't tell everybody what an incredible experience this was, to realize that we're making a whole different cycle of history thanks to Thomas and his family in restoring this Alexander house, and how wonderful the community has been there. I think we should mention dear Moritz Gruning. What a phenomenal human being, who I hope he can come visit us here in Florida as well, and who's been such a big part of the redemption. And I even had the opportunity of speaking in the church, if you remember, that weekend. I spoke at the church, and they welcomed me quite warmly. There were two things that were very strange, Thomas, when we took that trip to Berlin. First of all, in realizing in visiting the house, how I remember people saying to me, "Well, this was West Germany, and now you're walking into the border in East Germany." There was this big line drawn here. What a strange history! And you tell the story through that house of everything that happened after your family left with the wall and the different crazy people who were living in that house. The other strange thing is that right down the block, I don't remember the exact distance, couldn't have been more than 2 miles, is the house of the Wannsee conference. Remember that incredible morning we had there? Right down the block, where 25% of the homes were Jewish homes, where they masterminded the final solution in January of 1943. So you see this with such, it's hard to believe in these normal communities where this madness and this history occurred. And I hope that someday we'll be able to bring our own congregants to the Alexander House, and they're doing marvelous things there. I met is the woman who's the director still directing there, the one that I met?
Yeah, no. So Yasmin is no longer directing. We now have Berlin there on the ground. She lives in the village. But I would like to say a couple of things that you mentioned it. One is we had a very moving Shabbat there where Stuart lit the candles. It was the first time in 80 years that we had candles there. And we also put the mezuzah back on the door, which was incredibly moving. And also you said something which is really important, that this house has been a home for 5 families. So our family, the Alexanders, were there. But what I quickly realized was that the other families who lived in this house after we'd left had fallen in love with the house just as much as we had, and then it had been taken from them. And this house, this extraordinary house, had seen the history of 100 years of Germany. So the next family who moved in here were the Zells. They were this music publishing family, very, upper bourgeois, very similar to the Alexanders. They had a photo album which was almost identical. And they used to go out there on the weekends. And I don't know if I told you this, Stuart, but I met the daughter-in-law of Will Meisel. So Will Meisel was the music composer. And I met Doris Meisel, his daughter-in-law. She came to see the house a few years ago.
The dedication, if I remember.
She was there for the open. She was there for the open. She was there for the open day, and she kind of a short elderly lady with silver pants, very much from the rock and roll period. In the 1960s, she had promised that what the Nazis had done would not be forgotten. It's part of this 1968 era. And she said that her family didn't want her to come. They were very nervous for her. But she said, it's very important I'm here. She said, it's very important that the good and the bad are told. And she held this plastic bag in her hand. And she said, I want you to have this plastic bag. I said, okay. And she said, I want you to have this plastic bag because it's very important that history is told, both the good and the bad. I said, okay. And she said, I want you to have it. And it's very important to me that the truth is told. And I said, okay, but what's in the plastic bag? And she said, inside the plastic bag are the documents that prove that my family stole the house from your family. And it's really important that people know what happened. I found that incredibly moving. And then during open day, when we actually finished the renovations of the house in 2019, each of the rooms were dedicated to different families. There was a room for the Alexanders, there's a room for the Meisels, and there was a room for the other families. And in the Meisel room, they had donated a piano from the family, the old music records, a record player, posters. And during the open day, we had over 1,000 people come. And she stood in that room and welcomed everybody and told the story of her family. And I just thought that showed extraordinary bravery, but also wisdom to be there, to share the story of the house and what her family had done.
Well, I'm sorry. I was personally moved by the passion of everybody in the village.
Yeah.
And the people who came who really wanted to right the wrongs as soon as possible. And maybe you can reflect on Germany today and your feelings about being there. Berlin is such a fantastic city.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I was there 2 weeks ago. First time I'd been there for 18 months because of the pandemic. We had another event with over 500 people. I was a bit worried that after the pandemic, everything would be a bit quiet, but people were, if anything, more enthusiastic than ever. And the local elementary school kids had done a film about the house. I've done a children's book about the story, and some children interviewed me about it and read the story. We had an exhibition about Jews being in Germany for 1,700 years. including the families of the village, and with a bunch of tours. And I spent a lot of time talking with people about Germany. And as you know, the elections have just taken place, and I was asking people about it. And I was actually very reassured compared to what's going on in other countries. They seem to be taking a very moderate, sensible approach. As you know, Stuart, some of our family members have just returned to Germany. So, you know, in the 1930s, our family left Germany as Jewish refugees, but recently members of our family returned. So my sister married a Syrian Kurd, and some of their nephews and nieces arrived in Germany as part of that mass emigration because of the war in Syria. And extraordinarily, and I think partly because of what happened in the period of National Socialism, they felt they had this debt to the world. And so they took in over 1 million Syrians and other refugees during this period, 2015, 2016, which is an extraordinary number. If you think that England, for example, took about 15 or 20,000, and America were about the same, France, something similar. So Germany was extraordinarily generous. And amongst those were members of our family. And we met with them when I was there a couple of weeks ago, and they've been there for 6 or 7 years now. And it hasn't always been an easy time. There is definitely trouble on the far right. There is still problems with racism and Islamophobia. Anti-Semitism is very strong. But they say they're very happy to be there. And for the most part, they've been welcomed. And they're really grateful. And when they said they're really grateful, it reminded me of our family, because in 1985, 50 years after our family arrived in Britain, our family threw a Thank You Britain party with bunting, Union Jack bunting, and a toast to the Queen. And I think they read If by Rudyard Kipling and all these things. And my 2 uncles were dressed in these red coats. And our family is so grateful for Britain, at the same time critical, and, you know, we reserve the right to criticize, of course. And I think in the same way in Germany, you know, things are so stable, and in many ways they're the leaders in Europe in terms of inclusivity and integration and openness. So I'm very confident about Germany.
Certainly do that when you're there. Just before we get to some questions here, I just want to ask you briefly if you can tell us about your first book, Hans and Rudolf.
Sure.
Family relationship, what that book is about.
Yeah.
It reads like a novel, but it's all true. So maybe you can tell us a little.
Well, it's funny you should say that. So when I first heard this story, the book's about my great uncle Hans. So Uncle Hans is my grandmother Elsie's brother. There was twins. There was Hans and Paul. And in 2006, Hans died. And when I heard his eulogy by my father and his cousin Peter, I was really surprised, because some of the stuff I knew. You know, the family had left Germany. My great uncle had taken on the uniform, the British uniform, during the Second World War. But there was stuff I never knew. So he'd been in Belsai after the war. And then he'd become a Nazi hunter. And then I heard this extraordinary line, which I just found I just couldn't believe it when I heard it, that he had personally tracked down and arrested the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Hess. And you have to understand, my great uncle was a teller of tales. He was the one in the family who told us dirty jokes. You know, he was a real amazing person, very colorful. Right. And the idea that we'd never have heard this story before, it's just like, how is that possible? And I you know, I still to this day, it's amazing. And so when I heard that story, it was like, well, I have to look into it to find out if it was true. And then when I found out it was true, it then became really interesting to me what happened to the other side. So it became a dual biography of Hans, my great uncle, and then Rudolf, the commandant of Auschwitz. And I tell those 2 stories. I go between their 2 stories, ending with how they come together at the end.
Possible to put down. So how did your uncle find him? How did he get him to? I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how he got to Nuremberg and how he changed history. Your uncle. Sure.
So my great uncle, you know, he wasn't a detective. He had no training. He had no intelligence. But he knew that the Nazis were still at large, and he'd been interviewing. He'd had this horrible experience of interviewing some of the survivors in Belsai as the translator, and hearing firsthand about the transports, the selections, about the gassings in Auschwitz. I mean, horrendous. And he went to his commanding officer said, look, anyone can translate for you. Let me go out and find the Nazis. And he was told no. And I know this because we have a letter from him to Elsie, my grandmother, when he tells the story. And so then he just ignores his commanding officer and just does it anyway on the weekends. And in the letter to his grandmother, he says he's doing this in his spare time. I mean, imagine that today. You know, it's just crazy. You know, now we know the story so well. But at the time, you know, Germany was a chaos. The British and the Americans were focused on the Russians and the rocket scientists who could secure the nuclear weapons. Their focus wasn't on finding the Nazi war criminals. So my great uncles, they started learning on the job, and he started pulling in some of these lower level SS officers. And then he managed to persuade his commanding officer that he knew what he was doing. So they asked him to go after some of the bigger fish, as he would call them. And eventually he was asked to go after Rudolf Hess, who was in hiding in northern Germany near the Danish border. And they suspected he'd be there because there was sightings of his wife and his family nearby. And so after quite a long chase, he tracked down Rudolf Hess to this farmhouse near the Danish border. And the first time he saw him, Rudolf Hess was wearing pajamas, and my great uncle put his gun in the guy's mouth, because, you know, a lot of these Nazis they were killing themselves with the cyanide. And so he wanted to avoid that. They checked him for cyanide, there was no pill. And then he said, you know, you're obviously the commandant of Auschwitz, you're coming with us. And the guy says, no, I'm not. I'm Franz Lang. I just work here. I'm a laborer. And they went backwards and forwards a few times. And Franz Lang then showed him his papers, and it said Franz Lang. And Hans was like, I don't believe this is true. And then he was trying to work out what was going on. And he remembered that the SS had their blood type on their tattooed on their arm, but that had been removed. And so he's thinking, okay, what should I do? And then he had an idea, and he sent his captain to the kitchen. He said, go to the kitchen and go and get a big knife. And he came back, the guy came back with a big knife, and he gave it to Hans. And Hans said to the commandant, he said, look, you know, give me your ring. And the guy said, no, my ring can't come off. And he said, my uncle said, okay, well, I'm going to cut your ring off with this knife. So the guy then hands the ring over, and inside of the initials, because in Germany, couples often put their initials in the inside of the ring. So he found Rudolf Hess, and he took him into custody. And at the time, the Nuremberg Trials were going on. This was March 1946. And the Americans were really frustrated because none of the senior Nazis, there's 23 of them, were willing to accept any responsibility. You know, we're following orders, we're in the army, we didn't know what was going on. We never went to the death camps. And they were very frustrated. And unfortunately, the prosecution had rested, so they weren't able to interview or examine or enter Rudolf Hess as a witness. But they persuaded the defense to use Rudolf Hess as a witness to prove that Kaltenbrunner, one of the other defendants, had never been to Auschwitz. And so on the back of that, they then cross-examined Rudolf Hess. And for the first time, it was heard in court from somebody who obviously knew what was going on, because Rudolf Hess had not only run the camps, he'd set the thing up. He'd started there in 1940, and he left in 1944. There was a small period when he was away. And he just described in total detail about the camps, the selections, the transports, the gassings, the horror.
It was a turning point in the trials, wasn't it?
Well, it changed the course of the trial, because for the first time they had evidence of the mass.
They're all in denial.
And this was he was personally responsible for the murder of over 1 million men, women, and children.
And the other Nazis felt he had betrayed them, if I remember reading that. That was very interesting. What was his final fate that he was sentenced? Yeah,
so because he was a witness, he wasn't tried in Nuremberg. So at the time there was an agreement between the Allies that people would be tried where they committed the crime. So he was sent to Poland, and a year later he was found guilty, and then he was eventually hung on the gallows in Auschwitz next to the crematorium.
That's what happened. Good. Just briefly, let's get some questions, but maybe you can tell us about some of your new projects.
Sure.
New books coming out.
Sure. Well, we mentioned the children's books. There's a children's version of The House by the Lake, which I'm very excited about. That's available in America by Candlewick Press. And I've been working with the German embassy here in the States, doing a bunch of workshops with elementary schools, which has been amazing. I have a book called Future History, which comes out in March 2022 in the States. As I was saying earlier, it's I like to call it a non-fiction book. It's about the history of the next 30 years, told from the perspective of 2050. And then the next book coming out in Britain is called White Debt, which is the story of a uprising by enslaved people in a British colony and the legacy of slavery today, what it means and what we can do about it.
That's all comes here to the States as well. So why don't we take some questions here, Al? I don't know how you want to organize the questions and answer period. We get some responses from our very large audience here.
Marshall will be taking care of the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Before I take a question, I just want to tell the audience that I took the liberty a couple of weeks ago of Googling Thomas Harding plus Hans and Rudolf and checking out a video. It's a 45-minute video on YouTube about his book. It's a wonderful PowerPoint presentation. It's actually spellbinding. You'll be at the edge of your chair. Mr. Harding did not mention, nor will I squeal and give a spoiler as to how he found, how Hans found Rudolf. You're gonna have to find that out for yourself. I don't want to spill the beans, as they say, but it's a wonderful, wonderful video. It will really have you captivated, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful educational experience. I did see Bill Freund's hand raised during the presentation. So I'm going to ask Bill to unmute himself and come to the microphone, if you would, sir. Bill was there. He was there just a minute ago. All right. Does Elliot, do you see him? I do not see him.
Yeah, now I think I'm unmuted.
There he is. Great. Bill, it's all yours.
Well, I didn't really have my hand raised. It must have been an error. Maybe I was scratching my nose. But it was a wonderful presentation, and I congratulate you on it. You are really very eloquent. I was born in Germany, as many of you know, because I made a presentation here a few weeks ago. I grew up in Germany. I'm bilingual. I speak German just about as fluently as English, which isn't all that great. I was going to ask you how you briefly refer to it. I'm very much concerned, perhaps more than you are, about Germany turning to the right. There is the party, the AfD party, Alternative für Deutschland, which was very scaring when it was party practicing anti-Semitism on the side. But now that party has, I believe, an 18% representation in the German parliament. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime again.
So thank you for the question, Bill. So the AfD is definitely a problem, and in the local elections, they can be as high as 20 or 21%. So in Brandenburg, where the House is, the state of Brandenburg, I think it's 21, 22%. Nationwide, in the most recent elections, they actually did worse 2 weeks ago than they did previously. I think they were around, 10 or 11%. And I think as a note of optimism, maybe I'm too optimistic, none of the other parties will do any kind of coalition with them. They've been very clear about that. And I think given the fact that the country took over 1 million refugees recently, I think it's quite impressive how badly AfD has done. I think at any time in any country, there's going to be xenophobia and racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. I mean, we've seen it over the centuries, haven't we? The question is, how large does it get? And I think the anti-Semitism in Europe and the States has definitely risen over the last decade, without doubt. There's no question about it. You see it not only in the violent attacks, you see it in the graffitis of cemeteries, you see it on social media. It's vile, it's disgusting, to such an extent that we see it in some politicians who feel empowered to actually be anti-Semitic. which is horrifying. But I have to say that I do think, and my experience in Germany is one of optimism. Now, look, there are still problems without doubt, and we work with colleagues who deal with this every day, and they say there are definitely still problems, and there's still a large faction in Germany, a significant minority. You know, I wouldn't say it's any more than in Britain. Certainly, France, it's worse. You know, I think in the States, it's really bad in some places. So I mean, it's something definitely to worry about and be concerned about. But I'm personally not that worried about Germany more than any other country. And in many ways, I would say I'm less worried.
I've just been asked to repeat, if someone goes into Google and Google search, and they type in Thomas Harding plus Hans and Rudolf plus YouTube, that video will pop up. I do have a question, Mr. Harding, for you, and that is, so you heard the story about Hans, you heard the family get together. And then my next question is, well, how did you go about doing the hard research? Did you go to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum? Where in Germany did you go to find the hard facts? Could you detail that?
You're asking about Hans and Rudolf.
Hans and Rudolf, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Hans and Rudolf. So yeah, sure. So for sure. So when I write my books, I'm writing nonfiction, so I'm not making stuff up. So I have to go and find the hard facts. So a variety of sources. You know, it's about collecting testimony from those people who remember, both in my family, but also in Rudolf Hess's family, which was really hard because no one had ever interviewed members of the family before. And I was able to track down his daughter to Washington, D.C., in fact. And I had a long interview with her. I went to Auschwitz with his grandson. It's about looking at the archives. So I went to the archive in College Park in Maryland, where a lot of the documents are moved, National Archive in London in Kew. I went to Auschwitz and Sachsenhausen and Dachau. There's an institute in Munich, which has a lot of the documents. I went to Luxembourg as well. I also did some work in Paris. And then it's a lot of the stuff is available online now, from Nuremberg, from the Belsai trials. A lot of the testimonies are available online. And then it's about going to like other weird archives, like film archives or picture archives, you know. And it's about, for me, it's always about trying to narrow down a specific episode and then trying to get as much information as I can from that episode from different people's point of view. So I could talk about what color socks people are wearing and what the weather's like and what do they say and what happened, you know, to try and make the experience as rich as possible.
Thank you for that explanation. I see a question from our president. Mr. President, please unmute yourself.
Responsible for bringing Thomas here.
Thank you, Mr. Harding, for your superb presentation. I have a question for you regarding an article which appeared in the New York Times last year, and this was concerning the post-Brexit situation, stating that many British Jews were now seeking German passports. And in fact, it also mentioned your name in this article. So is this related to growing anti-Semitism in Britain, or what is prompting British Jews now to be seeking German passports?
Okay, so I think I could talk about me personally, and I'll talk about the general situation. So for me personally, I applied for my, I wasn't applying for a passport, just to be clear. I was asking for them to give me back something that had been taken from me. So in the 1930s, our family was German, and they took our citizenship from us. And there's a German law, according to the founding constitution of Germany in 1949, that if the citizenship had been taken from people for political reasons, including Jews, then by right, automatically, they don't have to be resident, they don't have to speak the language, by right, they have to have it back. And so I applied for it. And the reason why I did apply for it was for a few reasons. One was because I'd spent all this time now in Germany. And I was, by that stage, and I had a much better feeling about Germany and Germans and about the need and the importance of reconciliation. I also felt I was European, and I was not comfortable with the consequence of Brexit, which was that I was no longer going to be considered to be European. But there was something more than that. It was something about the rightness, the correctness of getting this citizen back that had been taken from my family. I applied, well, I was one of the first to apply, and I had a very, very moving experience with the German embassy in London. They took it very, very seriously, and they were personally, they told me a personally, a profoundly moving experience. And even now, they've done hundreds of these. Some of my relatives have recently got their citizenship back, and they tell me still it's being treated as such. In terms of the wider situation, there is something going on in Britain today, which is about Brexit. It is 100% about Brexit. Whether you've got Irish inherited ancestors, or Italian ancestors, or French ancestors, there are thousands of people who are applying for passports so that they can travel, live, work in Europe. I have not heard from anyone this is about anti-Semitism. This is about wanting to have the ability to be flexible, for your children to be flexible. The other day, as I said, I was in Germany, and it's quite shocking as a British person now. I mean, it's now because Brexit happened just before COVID, and now we're just able to travel again. When I arrived in Berlin, I could no longer go in the European line. I had to go in the other line, which was very long. And I said to my wife, Deborah, who doesn't have a German passport, I said, look, I'll just go in the European line, you go on the long line. She said, no, you're coming with me. So we went on the long line, and eventually we got to the front, and I handed the young guy in his 30s, short dark hair, the passport control guy, I handed him these two British passports. He was going through them. He said, have you been to Germany before? And I said, yeah, I've been here lots of times. He said, well, why are there no stamps in your passport? I said, oh, that's because I've got a German passport. He said, oh, well, give me the German passport. Quite rudely. I gave him the German passport. He said, can you speak German? I said, no. He said, how can you have a German passport if you can't speak German? I said, well, because the Germans stole citizenship from my grandparents. And it got very intense very quickly. All that to say that it's very real. This history is very real, and it's still very personal and very real. And it comes out at very strange times, like when you're going through customs or passport control. But the reason for getting the passport for me was it was both practical but also emotional and symbolic.
Good question. I wanted to ask you about Hess's daughter. I remember there was, you were surprised with her reaction and everything. Yeah. Her father, what did she say to you?
So Rudolf Hess, so let's not confuse. There's Rudolf Hess and Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess, H-E-S-S, is the assistant, the secretary to Adolf Hitler. Rudolf Hess, H-O-E-S-S, or H-O S-S, was the commandant of Auschwitz. It's very easy to get them confused. So I tracked down the daughter, Rudolf Hess, as I said, to Washington, D.C., and she was in her 80s, and she was very uncomfortable about speaking with me, but eventually she agreed. It took me 2 years to persuade her to talk with me, and we spoke on a number of occasions. Eventually I went to see her personally, and I arrived at the door, and she didn't want me to come in. She said, oh, I'm not feeling well today. I'm feeling old. I said, oh, that's a shame, because I just brought this beautiful chocolate cake from around the, from town. Are you sure? And she said, oh, come in. So we had some chocolate cake and we had some coffee. And then she started telling me about her childhood. And she was between 8 years old and 11 years old when she was in the villa. The villa, if you've been to Auschwitz, the Hess villa, the family villa, backs onto the camp. So the wall of the garden is the wall of the camp. And just the other side of the wall in the Auschwitz I, the first camp, is the old crematoria. And I said, I said, what was life like that? And she said, look, at the end of the day, my dad would come back tired and exhausted, and then he'd read us stories, and he'd put some music on, and he'd smoke a cigar, and then we might go and look at the animals, the horses, and we'd go for rides on the Solar River or go for sled rides. I said, okay, so what was he like? And he said, well, to me, he was the kindest, best father in the world. And hearing that, I just felt sick. And I said, after a minute's pause, I was like, how can you say that? How can you say he was the kindest, nicest father in the world when he was responsible for the murder? He personally was responsible for the murder of over 1 million men, women, and children. And she said, there must have been two sides of him. There was a side I knew, and this other side. And she'd read the book, she'd seen the movies. She wasn't denying what he'd done, but she just her relationship was as the daughter. And I found that so difficult to deal with because, and other people in Nuremberg who'd been studied by the psychologists said a lot of these people were normal or above intelligence. They weren't sociopaths or psychopaths. You know, they had chosen to do what they did. And that's what I found so disturbing. This was clearly somebody who could be loved by the daughter. And he, as far as she was concerned, could show empathy. Well, how was that possible? And murder so many people like that. And the idea that human beings could do that it was a question of choice, not because of compulsion, not because of some mental illness, I found unbelievably difficult. Because if it could be him, it could be anybody. You know, if it's just about choice, then it could happen again. Anyone could do it. Any group of people could do it. And we've seen it. We've seen it in Rwanda and Bosnia and so on. So I found that conversation incredibly hard.
Implications of that, the humanity of this is beyond belief because evil is normative. And that's the real tragedy of human. And how are we time-wise?
I think that we're getting close to wrapping it up, Rabbi. So if Mr. Harding and Rabbi, if you have any closing words, and then we'll turn it over to our president. So Mr. Harding, if you have any parting words, and then we'll turn it over to the Rabbi.
Well, just it's been a real honor and privilege to speak to you today, Stuart. So much. Thank you so much for your grace.
I miss you so much.
And likewise to you. Thank you so much, Stuart.
I miss you. I hope I see you soon.
Absolutely.
We're back visiting London. And I'm really honored that I was able to introduce my new family to your family and you, because you will become part of us as well. This is a memorable hour that we've spent together, and I thank you.
Absolutely, and you have an open invitation to come down to Sarasota, Florida. It's much nicer in February than Princeton, New Jersey, and probably London as well. I've never been to London, but I'll take my chances. Mr. President, please close out the afternoon.
Thank you. Well, first of all, a warm welcome to you all, and an especially warm welcome to Thomas Harding, to your parents, Frank and Belinda, and also to your cousin, your aunt, Vivian Lewis. So we welcome you here. On behalf of Temple Beth Shalom and the board and the entire congregation, I thank you for such a superb and amazing presentation. We are so privileged to have you here with us today. For the congregants listening in today, you may not know that Mr. Harding is part of an illustrious British family. You've heard about the Alexanders this afternoon, but he's also related to the Salmons and the Glucksteins, who are owners of the J. Lyons Tea Company. At one stage, this was the largest catering company in the world. Having lived in Britain and studied in Britain at various times of my life, I recall very fondly the J. Lyons Tea Companies, and as a high school student, nothing better than the pastries of J. Lyons, so I can still remember those. Your cousin Nigella Lawson is the well-known food critic and writer, so really a completely illustrious family. I had the great privilege of reading Hans and Rudolf way back when it was first produced. I'd read the review in The Guardian, and I subsequently got to read it, and it really is a page turner, having been translated into no less than about 16 languages. But your book, The House by the Lake, especially resonates with me for two reasons. One is that it represents and reflects on German history over the decades, as you've told us. And secondly, my wife and I spent an entire day in Glienicke, which you described, visiting the ponds, the lakes, going to Potsdam. It's a beautiful part of the world, but also houses some of the most sinister episodes in our history. So that book really resonates with me. We, all over the world, are concerned about the global rise in anti-Semitism, and particularly we think about current events in Germany. So it is very reassuring and interesting to hear about your comments in contemporary Germany. Thank you. I'd like at this stage to thank Rabbi Stuart Altshuler for being the catalyst. As he mentioned earlier on, the Distinguished Speaker Series actually emanated from a dinner conversation. A few nights after Stuart came over to us for dinner, we started talking, and I asked if he knew Thomas Harding, and The result was amazing, and Stuart couldn't believe how incredulous I was when I heard about this friendship of yours. So this was the beginning of our Distinguished Speaker Series. So thank you, Stuart, for being the catalyst, Rabbi Altshuler. So, Mr. Harding, Thomas, we hope that we see you and your family here in Sarasota one day. We look forward to having you visit Temple Beth Shalom, and we all wish you continued success. Thank you once again.
Thanks so
again,
much.
sir.